In previous videos I've taken a look at other offerings from the 14-inch Mego line, including the creature from the Black Lagoon, so today I thought I'd turn my attention and take a closer look at the Dracula. Now I must admit that of the 3 Universal horror monsters that have been released in the 14-inch scale from Mego, Dracula is probably the one I was most anticipating. I'm a huge fan of the creatures from the Black Lagoon. I think they did an absolutely wonderful job of that figure, but Dracula is arguably the most famous of all the Universal monsters. And I was already very impressed with the 8-inch scale version of this character. So I was expecting big things from this figure. Now, to start off with, we have the packaging, and as I've commented in other videos for figures in this line, the packaging is often very underwhelming. It's very tall, because of course these are big figures and the packaging is even taller, but they are relatively narrow, which is merciful for when you want to store them on the shelf. The front of the packaging is mostly window display. There's not a lot of decoration going on in what else we can see on the packaging. I think this is styled to be a coffin. We can see that sort of oak wood panelling around the edges of the packaging and on the front of the packaging. And inside, the interior inlay has that sort of red padding as if it was the interior of a coffin. However, it's not shaped in a coffin. I think it would have been really cool if they had actually shaped the entire packaging like that. That would have made it a lot more presentable and stand out a lot more. As it is, it's a little bit dull. That said, I do think that the reverse of the packaging is very nicely done. We have obviously that fantastic image there. It's an illustration that's been painted of Dracula, and quite clearly Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And then to top it off, we have the coffin behind him, we have the vampire bat on top of that. I think this looks really moody, atmospheric. It's also strangely colourful and really quite fun. So I think this is actually pretty displayable, and it's actually a very nice touch. I'm really happy with this. But how does the figure fare once he is liberated from his packaging? Well, on first impressions, he's visually quite striking, but a lot of that has to do with his size and scale, and his big billowing cape. But when you look beyond that, there's actually a couple of things that are fairly disappointing about this figure. Chief amongst them for me is the head sculpt, which, as you can probably tell, is mostly a blank canvas, and a lot of the detail is coming from the paint application. The hairline is ever so slightly raised, but there's no real texture to this at all. It's still a very smooth spherical head. And the only texturing and volume and shape comes from the paint apps that have been used over it. Except they've used a sort of grey paint, so it doesn't really look quite accurate. This isn't what we're used to seeing on Dracula. And we can see this a lot more clearly if we take a look at a photograph of Bela Lugosi, and we can see all the creative liberties they've taken with this figure. The expression and the eyebrows are absolutely fine. I think they've caught that likeness pretty well. But when we look at things like the mouth, the fact that they've painted in those fangs with the red outline just looks really cheap and nasty. And like I said, this is not sculpted in, this is literally just painted on. It looks really childish. Likewise, around the eyes, they've added that layer of shadow, which I think they probably could have got away with, except that because they had the blood red eyes, just makes this a little bit cartoonish and a little bit silly. As a point of comparison, we can look to the 8-inch scale version of this figure. Obviously, a very different head sculpt with very different paint apps, but I much prefer the attempt here on the 8-inch scale than I do on the 14-inch scale, because the 8-inch actually looks like a pretty decent, earnest attempt to faithfully recreate Bela Lugosi, whereas the 14-inch scale just looks to be a little bit cartoonish and a bit too generic. And then we come to the body and the tailoring, which is very clumsy and quite loose and a little bit unfinished. There's lots of loose seams on mine, and it just feels very cheap. It's a very thin material that they've used. It doesn't really look flush or finished, and it doesn't really fit the body very tightly, as we know they can do from other figures that we've seen in this line. They have opted to give him the silk waistcoat and shirt, and even that bow tie, although the bow tie is a little bit too flush, a little bit too thick and wide when it should be narrower and tighter to the neck. And it's a real shame, but the lapels of the outer jacket want to fold open, and that isn't their best look. They should fold neatly into the chest and should look pretty tight. Instead, we're seeing the inside of the jacket rather than the outside, which, yeah, isn't a great look. They have given him some new hands though. I believe these are new for this figure. I don't think I've seen these before, I may be wrong, but I think this mould works very well for Dracula. Whereas the boots and trousers are very basic, there's a very minimal effort gone into these really. I think they work just fine, and thankfully there's no impediment to him standing up. You can pose in multiple positions and these boots will not resist, which is good. But by far, the most successful element of this figure is the cape. I think they've done a really nice job of this. For a start, they've used a couple of different different materials. On the outside we have this sort of felt material which is very nice to touch. Meanwhile on the inside we have this silk lining which looks really effective. They've gone for a sort of champagne colour which looks really rich, very sumptuous and spot on for Dracula. Plus it's also quite a nice length so that it fits around him quite snugly whilst at the same time presenting lots of options for display. And if we take a look under his cape, we can see the tails of his jacket behind him. Now again, this sadly does look a little rough around the edges. You can see where the materials got bunched up and creased quite a bit, and it's a shame because it could have looked pretty fantastic and the tailoring just isn't quite right. It's not quite tight enough in the right places, and this just looks a bit too wide a gap in the coattails there, so it doesn't look quite as effective as it should really, which is a real shame. In terms of articulation, there's probably not going to be any surprises here, but he does have a swivel at the neck, so he can spin his head 360 degrees if you want him to. He's got ball joints at the shoulders, and of course there's no elastic bands to be found here, so he can lift his arms up and out to the side, which is great. This is supported by a single joint at the elbow, so he can bend his arm to roughly 90 degrees. There's a pin swivel at the wrist, so he can rotate that wrist 360 degrees and of course hinge his hands forwards and backwards. And there's a ball joint in the waist, allowing him to turn from side to side, lean from side to side, and bend forwards and backwards as well. There's another ball joint in the hips, allowing the legs to kick out to the side, to kick forwards and backwards, and then there's another single joint at the knee which bends the lower leg to about 90 degrees, and then there is a final pin swivel at the ankle, allowing the lower foot to spin all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. For accessories, he does come with an extra pair of hands. Now you may recognise these hands as being the same ones that usually come with, say, the Batman or the Superman figures that we've looked at in this series. They're a sort of open gripping hand, so you could put things in these hands if you wanted to. Not strictly necessary for Dracula, but I suppose it is nice to have some options. Now, all in all, I have some pretty mixed feelings about this figure. I do really like this line. I think the size of these figures and the articulation is pretty fun and makes them fun to collect, and there's just something about this scale that puts them in a league of their own, really. And I do think they've done an absolutely tremendous job with that cape. It's really luxurious and it really sets the figure off, and I think they've done a really great job of that. That being said, there's definitely a few things that are quite disappointing about the figure, and for me, the most crucial one is that head sculpt. I really wish they hadn't painted in the fangs. It just really cheapens the effect, and I think some of the tailoring is really off in this figure. I think a thicker material was really needed for the suit, just to make it a bit tighter, a little bit closer to the body, and just a bit more neatly tailored. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.